Welcome to the room B2 of the Houston Permitting Center. Not quite directly below the Green Building Resource Center, upstairs on the first floor. I'm Steve Stelzer, I'm the program director. And so one of the things we do, besides advise the public about green building and offer green building strategies complimentary of the City of Houston for anybody who's got a project that's in the works. What else? We put on these education seminars. So I'm very, very gratified and happy that y'all wanted to come to this one. This is our first one for 2020. And I've been kind of excited once I found out about these incentives. Laura over there has been running this for a couple of years now. And so I said, hey, when do you want to come over and educate the public about this? That's what I do. And she goes, oh, okay, let's be working on that. So, usually we have a little infomercial from the U.S. Green Building Council, but we can do that at the end. So, oh, Francis?
U.S. Green Building Council.
Yeah, there we go. Francis, do you want to say anything about the USGBC or before we get started?
Oh, sure.
Okay, come on up.
Hello, I'm Chris Logan too. I work with Courtesy Architecture. USGBC, the U.S. Green Building Council, has a local Gulf Coast chapter here in the Houston area, and we actually pair with Steve or the City of Houston to put on these seminars. We have a couple events throughout the year. We actually have one that's a happy hour that's happening on, I think, next Thursday, March 5th at Completeness Estuary. Am I right about that, Connor?
You are.
Excellent. So if you are ever interested in becoming a member or learning more about USGBC, feel free to go to usgbctexas.org to find out more information. Thank you.
Okay, quick show of hands. Members of USGBC in the room? Okay, good. So it's not like, nobody knows what it is. Feel free to ask questions. All right, so let's get started. We've got some really good speakers tonight. I'm so happy. Let's see. Anna came in from Austin. She's with Environment Texas, Anna Farrell Sherman. And she works to protect the waterways of Texas by advocating for nature-based infrastructure through work with the TWDB. Texas Water Development Board. There we go. Local governments, other nonprofits, and community partners. So she earned her BA in computer science from Wellesley College in, where's that?
It's in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts, there we go. And where her research on light-driven anaerobic microbial oxidation of manganese. And it was recently published in the journal Nature. So, whoa, all right. How about a quick applause for that? That's not too bad. All right. So her work has been featured in the Houston Chronicle, Texas Observer, and TV stations across the state. She is the author of Environment Texas's 2020 Stormwater Scorecard, ranking local Texas governments on how well they support the use of nature-based infrastructure. So my method to my madness of having Anna here was, so what else is going on in the state, so that when you hear about what we're doing in Houston, you can find out if we're leading the charge or, kind of following up. Okay, so then we're going to have Michael Bloom, who is an engineer with R.G. Miller Engineers, and he directs their sustainability practice. He was an expert contributor to the report Harvesting the Value of Water, Stormwater, Green Infrastructure, and Real Estate, published by the Urban Land Institute. Hey, I'm going to say, let's have an applause for that one, too. Look at that. So Michael assisted in the City of Houston's Living with Water design workshop as part of the city's 100 Resilient Cities Resilience Plan. Yay. And he serves on the advisory board of Global Affairs Associates, a sustainability reporting and management consulting firm. He is an envisioned sustainability professional, which is, anybody else envision? Okay, one back, two. Mr. on his list but hasn't done it yet. That's really a very cool thing that we all ought to do, and some of us have done it, so I'm very happy about that. All right, he's also a board-certified environmental engineer and licensed professional engineer in Texas and 7 other states. Originally from the suburbs of Philadelphia, he has lived in West Houston since 1998. He shares his home with a master gardener wife. Yeah, I know what it's like living with a gardener. I'm okay with that. 2 college-age daughters, oh boy, 3 cats, and a dog, so there we go. All right, then last but not least, who's going to be actually starting us off, Laura Patino, is the Chief of Staff to Chief Recovery Officer Stephen Costello at the City of Houston. Laura works to address flooding and localized urban drainage challenges for the City of Houston through the various disaster recovery programs, including Harvey. Laura has focused on advancing the city's green infrastructure program since her arrival to Houston in 2018, which is the first time we met. She came over and said, "What's this Green Building Resource Center?" So I told her, and then she never came back. Just kidding. She earned her Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Engineering at LSU in 2013, and her Master's in Bioresource Engineering and Integrated Water Resources Management at McGill University in Montreal in 2018. Prior to her role with the city, Laura worked in the private sector focusing on soil and groundwater remediation for oil-contaminated sites and salt-impacted soils. So without further ado, this is, wow. What a panel. Let's get Laura up here and get us kicked off.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Well, good evening, everybody. I am Laura Patino, and I am so happy and very excited to be here presenting to you guys today about green infrastructure. This is a topic that I know has been in Houston for such a long time, and that some of us pay attention to, but it's not widely discussed. And so now we're jumping on that momentum to really make it a reality in Houston. So today I'm going to keep my comments brief because I do want to make it so that we can hear mostly about the green incentive study that I had the opportunity to work with Michael on from 2018 to 2019, and Anna and the incredible work she's doing with Environment Texas. So I know most of the folks that do come to these events are pretty aware of what green development, green infrastructure is, but I like to start off by just really explaining in very simple terms what green infrastructure does. And really the best way to describe it is that it's a way to regulate water quantity and water quality. And so when we look at the development of a site, we typically cover it in gray. We put impervious surfaces that really don't let water absorb into the soil. And what green infrastructure does is try to bring back that capacity of the site that is being developed to infiltrate water and let that water soak up into the soil. With that, there are many benefits, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. But really, what's different and what is worthwhile to point out is that while typically in Houston we see many gray systems, green systems incorporate green roofs, rain gardens, bioswales, permeable pavement, and just make a site look prettier. This is another exhibit that I like to show of just really how covering our landscape impacts the flow of water. And so the more we cover it with pervious surfaces and concrete, the less water is absorbed into the soil, and the more water rushes down into our stormwater systems, overburdening them. So simplified problem, if we increase our impervious surfaces, we increase the volume of runoff, and we potentially cause more flooding downstream. So some real examples of green infrastructure in Houston, because they do exist. We have, that I've recorded, over 50 examples in private and public, and every day we're continuing to track and capture more. We have planter boxes, tree boxes in Cottage Grove, rain gardens associated with those tree boxes in Cottage Grove as well. There's a rainwater harvesting system associated with Fire Station 90. We have bioswales on Bagby Street. Green roofs in high schools, and then we have more of the reach scale green infrastructure that is included in our bayou system. So one example of that is the constructed wetlands along Brays Bayou. But green infrastructure doesn't just provide benefits to stormwater quality and quantity. It also, aside from helping capture water and help with flood mitigation, it also improves neighborhood aesthetics. It helps with water conservation. It improves the health and well-being of people. It reduces heat when we're looking at our pervious cover and how much that impacts our urban heat island effect. Adding green spaces and natural spaces allows us to cool down the areas. And we all know that in Houston, that is a big problem, especially in the summer. So, what does this mean for Houston and how can we move forward? So earlier this month, on February 12th, the city released the resilience strategy called Resilient Houston. So this is the cover. Michael's has the book, which is really the culmination of a year-long process, planning process that involved different stakeholders. They got together to look at the different shocks and stressors that the city faced and then identified ways into solving those challenges. This work was led by Chief Resilience Officer Marissa Aho, and so with the release of that strategy, we're now moving into implementation. But what does it include? Well, it really presents a vision for where Houston, how Houston needs to move forward. And so the definition of urban resilience is the capacity within an urban area to survive, adapt, thrive, no matter what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So when we talk about green infrastructure and the opportunity that it gives us to transform, to not just look at solving one problem, but solving multiple problems, it's a clear example of how our communities can be more resilient. There's also 18 goals and targets in this strategy, and 62 actions that are reflected in the 5 different themes, which are a healthy place to live, an equitable, inclusive, and affordable city, a leader in climate adaptation, a city that grows up and not out, and a transformative economy that builds forward. So I am happy to say that out of those 18 goals, 4 of them are specifically associated with green infrastructure and green development. One of those goals is to have 100 green infrastructure projects, public or private, by 2025. Another one is to plant 4.6 million new native trees by 2030. That's roughly 2.5 trees per Houstonian. So start planting trees. Carbon neutral, become carbon per year. Yeah, it's doable, right? Carbon neutral, become carbon neutral by 2050 in accordance with the Paris Agreement. So there has been stakeholder meetings in the creation of the city's climate action plan. And as green infrastructure was integrated into the resilience strategy, green infrastructure is also integrated into this climate action plan because of its capacity to help absorb carbon and capture carbon, as well as mitigate our carbon emissions. And finally, conserve 24% of undeveloped lands as natural spaces by 2040. So like I said, all of these goals are organized by themes, but in the strategy, which can be accessible in the link, and I will make that available to you all, we have 5 different chapters. And basically each chapter is divided in scales of what can be done at an individual scale to have prepared and thriving Houstonians, what can be done at the neighborhood scale for safe and equitable neighborhoods, what can be done to our bayous to make sure that they're healthy, connected, and that we come back to the bayous and bring back the face to the bayou as this ecosystem that helps us thrive. What can be done at the city scale as an accessible and adaptive city. So what that means is maybe incorporating more green infrastructure projects into city right-of-way. And finally, an innovative and integrated region. So how do we work with our partners, not just within the city, not just within the county, but also nonprofit, state, and federal to help drive green infrastructure projects. So moving forward, the city is taking an active leadership role in green infrastructure, planning to demonstrate, incentivize regulate and standardize, and educate on green infrastructure. So some of the examples that I do want to highlight that have taken place since the release of the incentives report, which Michael will touch on briefly, are the release and implementation of the resilience strategy, which has begun. Pursuing specific grants for demonstrations, some of them with EPA, some of them with private organizations, to demonstrate green infrastructure in private property, in public right-of-way, in parks, and how the different uses of green infrastructure can be highlighted around the city of Houston for the different purposes. How we can integrate green infrastructure into capital improvement projects and also into recovery. So the city has received or is receiving funds from multiple federal agencies for recovery projects. All of these are being evaluated to see how green infrastructure can be incorporated. And one example is the Inwood Forest Detention Basin Project funded by FEMA, which was an old golf course that is now being turned into a series of detention basins. And on top of that, the city has partnered with the Houston Parks Board to identify ways to how to build and incorporate recreation facilities, as well as ensure that the detention basin serves as a dual purpose for the community. So incorporating and making sure that it integrates wetland and prairie restoration and preservation and green infrastructure components. We're developing a low impact development green infrastructure project tracker, as well as continuing to identify partnerships with local, state, and federal, and the private sector to advance and incorporate projects. So I will leave it at that. Brief overview of what the city has done and where we're headed in terms of green infrastructure. And now I'll hand it over to Michael so that he can go more into detail about what these incentives look like and where we're at in terms of implementation.
In the last 5 years, how many green infrastructure projects have been completed?
So I started this spreadsheet 2 years ago. That spreadsheet was actually 100 projects within Houston and Harris County. So 50 had been completed by 2018. We have continued to track. Right now there are 10 in the pipeline as concept projects, both private and public, so we will continue to see how they're moving forward.
Cool, very cool.
Second question, you talked about carbon capture. Besides trees, were there any carbon capture technology proposed?
So we don't expand on it in the incentives report, but one of the feedback that we've gotten is to explore the capacity of soil to capture carbon, and specifically how to integrate like the soil amendments with specific microbes to help capture more. So that's something that we definitely need to look at a bit more.
Yeah. I have a question. I think most people in the room are very familiar with green development, and what I've noticed might be abs, and I'm an engineer. We love numbers. It would be very helpful if we could see studies that showed, for example, when we turn a square mile of asphalt into permeable ground, it saves us, there's an avoided cost associated with that.
Yeah.
That would be extremely helpful for budgeting purposes for the city and the county to justify the projects going forward. And I hope that exists out there. I would love to see that.
So I'll let Michael speak on that because that was part of what was considered in the incentive study, recognizing that funding is limited and that grant money can just be handed out, that there are other types of incentives. And so the concept of cost avoidance and looking at the entire life cycle of a project was explored. So I'll let Michael explore on how we used it. We designed a test site and played with numbers to prove that concept. So.
Thank you.
There we go. All right, well, thanks, everybody. So again, appreciate everyone coming out on what day is it, Wednesday evening? And to hear about green infrastructure. So this is the hard copy report that I'm going to be speaking about, and it's also available on a free PDF download. And then there are 4 appendices that go with it that are for the engineers in the room that want to dig into the numbers and get into more details. Basically, what I want to highlight here is just a quick introduction to some of the regulatory structure or the background on Houston that many of you might be aware of, but then also talk about the different aspects of the study, and then the conclusion in terms of what the incentives were, and then give a little update that Laura provided regarding where we are with implementation. So the first thing to realize about Houston is that we're very flat. We have a very low rate of infiltration in most of the soils in the area. Obviously a lot of rain. And one thing that's really important also to note especially when you're benchmarking us against other cities in the country, is that we don't have a combined sewer system. And so I'm interested in just generally talking to folks about the terminology. There's a lot of lingo and terminology in the engineering or infrastructure sector. So just by a show of hands, who knows the difference between a separate sewer system and a combined sewer system? Oh, fair number. Okay, excellent. So a combined system was one option that you could buy as a city manager in the 1880s. That was one pipe for both stormwater and wastewater. Cut your costs in half, and the engineer that was going around selling that to big urban cities, did well. Of course, nowadays when it rains, we're a little sad that there's untreated sewage going out into the river, because that's what happens when it rains. The system overflows. And so many of the cities that are kind of light years ahead of us in terms of green infrastructure are light years ahead of us because a federal court has ordered them to be. Because you can use green infrastructure to store and manage the water on the surface before it gets into the combined sewer system and before it causes an overflow. So anyway, that's why a lot of cities like Seattle and Philly and St. Louis and Portland and Baltimore and New York have these great, big, fancy programs with lots and lots of money being spent every year. And we don't, because we have a separate sewer system. Now, that doesn't mean that the sanitary sewer pipe doesn't leak, because it does. Our sanitary sewer system needs work, and so we do have a consent order to fix that, but that's just sanitary wastewater, which is, of course, important to fix, but it doesn't relate to storm. So we talked a little bit about that. We also don't have any real significant enforcement in terms of stormwater quality. We just don't, because of the political structure of not only our state, but also the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and the federal court system. And so we don't have a combined system, as I mentioned. So this kind of sets the stage about where we are and why we are where we are. Of course, we also get hurricanes, and this was kind of one of the triggers, really, that started talking, everyone started talking more about stormwater management and resiliency and all the different tools in the toolbox. So anyway, our study was funded by the Houston Endowment, and actually, I think in cutting my slides back, I omitted my acknowledgement slide. So let me pause for a moment and acknowledge everyone. Obviously, Laura and Steve were the main clients, and we're working hand in hand with them and all the other departments at the city. So they get a big thanks from the team. We had Corona Environmental Consultants out of Denver. They are specialized in environmental economics, and they did the whole analysis of the Philadelphia Green Infrastructure Program back in the early 2000s. We also had Neptune, which was a one-person firm, Elisa Villarama, who was formerly with the Natural Resources Defense Council, a water policy attorney. So anyway, those were the folks, and of course, Asakura Robinson. They were the landscape architect as well as graphic design, and they were invaluable in getting the report to come out as beautiful as it did. So anyway, we had these main parts, just looking at benchmarking. We talked to a lot of folks with the Greater Houston Builders Association, the Houston Real Estate Council, the Urban Land Institute, all the development folks about people who do basically redevelopment or infill type work. So this was all focused on private sector use of green, not public sector use of green infrastructure. And we came up with a bunch of incentives, brainstormed them, did some analysis of those, screened them down, and I'm kind of giving you a preview of what the next slides, but came up with the 4 that recommended, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of how we got there. These were the cities that we interviewed, and again, some of them are combined sewer system cities, so they may have incentives, but they also have a federal judge checking how much money they're spending every year, basically, right? So I remember right when we began this study, or just quickly, shortly before we started, Elisa, who we had hired on as a sub, when she was with the Natural Resources Defense Council, had released a nice report, 50 pages, on, it's called Catalyzing Green Infrastructure on Private Property for the City of New York. And I was like, yes, awesome, pay dirt, this has the answer, right? So I flip open the thing, I'm flipping through it, and I'm looking, wow, they're spending a lot of money here. So then I read one of the footnotes, and it says, well, the reason why they created that report was to figure out how to spend the $50 million a year that they had to spend under the consent order. So I was like, dang it, not quite as perfect as I was hoping. But anyway, so we did get a lot of good information, though, qualitatively. A lot of it was about, really obviously talking to the developers about what was going to change their decision-making. Because even if you have a big bucket of money that you have to spend, it's hard to give that money away if the developer doesn't see it as a value, right? If it doesn't really change the project performance and the profit and the sales and the amenity value and all of that. So it's really about the business case. And again, of course, when you're dealing with any kind of programmatic system like this with a large organization like the city and the permitting requirements and the ordinance requirements, just coordinating amongst all those departments is super important. So then we went ahead and started talking to the development community, got a lot of ideas about what they thought. Everyone wanted cash. Like, yeah, please, a bucket of money would be great. We would love to do green stuff. But we don't obviously necessarily have a bucket of money lying around, so that was part of the discussion about how you could do it in a way that didn't require a big expenditure up front of taxpayer dollars. And then, again, just additional ideas that were brainstormed. Folks that were kind of involved in this, we tried to get people that were skeptical or that we knew had big projects, but we also kind of automatically self-selected. People were coming to us that were already sort of in that camp. So they were already kind of thinking innovatively and coming up with interesting ideas. So we got a lot of good information. Then that led to a list of the candidate incentives and a screening process. A lot of it was related, obviously, to timing. If you have, let's say you put money down on a piece of property, you may have even closed on the property. Every day that you have $1 million or $10 million invested in that piece of property that you're not earning revenue from it is a day of interest. So timing matters in the development process if you ever look at the way the projects make money. And so that was super important to think about. And then, of course, a lot of the entitlement process. In the development community, the entitlement process is basically getting your engineering drawings approved, getting your permits, getting all the different permits and approvals from the city or the county in order to move forward. Those are called entitlements. It basically allows the project to proceed. And there's a real time, obviously, and cost associated with doing that as well. And it also changes the shape of what you build. Right? If your entitlement process has setback requirements or parking requirements or landscaping requirements, it literally changes what you're allowed to build there. And the architects and planners know this instinctively. So we talked a little bit about some of these alternatives. And jumping to the the screening process, really, there was a lot of stuff that would have been really great from the developer's perspective, but really, really hard to do for the city because of either administrative burden or technical requirements or money, or vice versa. There may have been fairly easy things that the city could do, but that weren't very motivating to the developer. So we came up with this fairly large, fairly complicated screening process that you can read about in one of the technical appendices, if you wish, that basically color codes it out, and it basically screened out to a smaller subset. I think there were maybe 10 or 12 of the green column here at the final land. Wow, the color's really coming out different on that screen. Anyway, it's like vibrant green on this screen. And so those are the ones that we actually did and analyzed in more detail with actual cost estimating and evaluating the developer cost and benefits versus the city cost and benefits. And then that led to, okay, this short list of the ones that we dug into more deeply: timing, financial, and awards. And then also related to the ordinances in terms of parking, landscaping, stormwater conveyance, and stormwater detention, and stormwater quality, all were on the table. And then the evaluation, again, this is kind of digging into a little maybe too deep, but basically we did a fairly rigorous evaluation, both legal policy and cost evaluation, and came out with four options. The first, or four incentives recommended. And one of them was basically take all of the complicated and sometimes conflicting rules about stormwater and parking and landscaping and setbacks and make them work together well so that the developer and the architect and the land planner could be more creative and really amenitize parking and stormwater to be all sort of working holistically. And that hasn't happened yet, but it's on the table. The other thing we talked about was a property tax abatement. So if you're redeveloping and you want to do something really green and really that's going to be a public good to the surrounding properties and the public space around that area, maybe we could cut you a break on the tax bill increase and then just defer that revenue for a little bit. And then the other one was, hey, do you want the mayor to come to your press conference and cut your ribbon and be there on your opening day? So we're set to there. Marissa's like got the mayor's on speed dial, so we're good to go there. And then there's also this whole permitting process, which is really, a challenge in a lot of cities around the country, but particularly here, especially when the economy is doing well and there's just a ton of redevelopment and permitting and process of just the volume going through this building is astounding. I'll just say that right now if you don't know about it. The number of permits being pulled for different things for new development is very high. So what we want to do here is create a process where just the normal permitting processes can be expedited and maybe done with a big cash payment and get all the disciplines in one room at one time, do like a single day permit review. And then if you did green, though, it would even be better than that. So that's the idea there. And so this is the website to download this report and all the appendices. So it's houstontexas.gov IGD, which stands for Incentives Green Development, HTML. And then the implementation plan originally showed, a year or two of stakeholder work for each one. So it wasn't like, we didn't go through every single detail and come up with like, here's the draft ordinance, please adopt this. It's devil in the details, a lot of work to be done by all the departments and stakeholders. So that's kind of what's was on hold for a little bit between like this past summer and the election in November, right? Gosh, I wonder why. And now that the election's done and he won a second term, Mayor Turner and Marissa, they released the resilience plan, like everything's teed up for hardcore implementation for the next 12 months. And so this was the update that Laura provided to me not too long ago. This was for a presentation I did with another group, and basically everyone's meeting to talk about the implementation. There's even developers that are talking to folks about different pilot testing. And of course, this is now past February 12th, so that's already done. And so we're super excited that it's happening. There was a meeting here 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago to talk about some of the rules about detention. And they're gonna continue to meet monthly in this room or somewhere for this task force to talk about it. And so with that, I think we're maybe do 1 or 2 quick clarifying questions. And of course, you can email me or follow up later if you want, and then we'll do, Anna, go ahead, sorry.
Is there a role that Envision certification plays in these incentives?
So the question was, is there a role for Envision in this incentives program? And so for folks that don't know, we are sitting, this is a great opportunity for me to explain it. So U.S. Green Building Council, who many of you are members of, and this is actually a meeting kind of like hosted by them, right? So you guys beat the engineers and planners by like 15 years, maybe even more than that, to stand up the LEED program, like in the mid-90s, so Leadership in Environment and Energy Design, yay, team. Then the engineers and planners were like, hey, we want one of those. Totally, that's what happened. I'm just saying that a bunch of engineers were in the room, we were like, hey, we should have one of those. So we came up with Envision, which is basically the same exact thing for horizontal infrastructure and planning and like engineering. So that's my little soundbite on what Envision is. And so no, there's not like an explicit thing with Envision on this. Envision is very much focused on a single project and getting some percentage of 1,000 points on the single project. And a lot of this incentive discussion is very more policy programmatic concepts. So maybe there's some overlap, but really, and this only really would talk to some degree, only a handful of the 64 credits in Envision, whereas, certainly like the resilience plan, I think mentions Envision at least once, if not more. So there's some other opportunities there.
And I think as Envision is more widely adopted in the city, there are opportunities to link it back to the recognitions and or incentive for Envision projects itself, but further down the line.
And I think also in a way, like Envision, in order to achieve a certain verified level in Envision, you kind of have to use green infrastructure. You could use green infrastructure to get some of those points, although it's not necessarily the best way to get Envision points. So it kind of depends. Anyway.
You commented on the lack or the weak enforcement on stormwater quality in the area. Why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is? Well, so Texas has a culture of individual property rights being very, very high, a high value on individual property rights. We have a very conservative federal court that oversees the federal laws, and pretty much the only stormwater enforcement that's available to anyone is through the Federal Clean Water Act. And we have I think I'll stop there.
So you guys didn't consider that as part of like the stormwater quality really strengthening, trying to get the existing regulations under like the multi-sector general permit in Harris counties to make this more?
Well, if you're trying to convince a private developer who is delivering some sort of economic activity in your community using private investment money, and you're trying to get that person or that company to use the green approach, you want to create the business case for that and explain why that it would provide a higher return on their investment and how it provides a higher faster lease up, higher tenant satisfaction, stickier tenants, all of the business case for them. And if you say to a developer, yeah, we'd like you to do this green bioswale because it's going to save the fish and the bayou downstream, they're going to say, sorry, that's not of interest to me.
But then how come we don't flip the tables? How come we don't say as a society that we want our developers to keep our groundwater clean, our water clean, and groundwater clean, because of their activities? Much like an industrial facility has to comply with regulations so that they're not contaminating, developers and such should have to do the same type.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think without going too far down the road, because we have another speaker, I would just say that that's a policy decision that's based on elections and voting.
I'd like to draw a distinction between, you spoke as if you were talking about the state of Texas. I'd like to draw a distinction between the city of Houston and Austin and San Antonio. The conversation in those two cities is always about quality and quantity. I'm the university architect at U of H. I've been very surprised by, there is never a conversation about quality here, stormwater quality, never. All the great civil engineers in the city of Houston come and do our projects. Not one of them talks about water quality. It's always about quantity. And why?
Why is that? I'll tell you exactly why that is. If you go to Austin, you have a sole source aquifer with a high infiltration rate.
No, I know about that side.
And that's why they care about it. And here we don't care about it, honestly, because we have a low infiltration rate.
Right.
We get our water from somewhere else, from 20,000 feet down.
Close to the Gulf, so we can just ship it there.
Right, and we have a flooding problem, right? So volume and flooding is much higher priority. And we have a culture of valuing individual property rights. This is just my opinion. I've been here for 20 years. I came from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's not even a state. But anyway, after 20 years, I think I kind of get a little bit of the perspective.
Right.
I do just want to add a final comment. Action 26 in the resilience strategy specifically talks about how to clean Houston's bayous and watersheds and identifies partners that we can work with to be able to start this conversation that we haven't had. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right, well, while Anna's setting up, I just kind of want to point out a couple of educational things going on. We've got our rain barrel and compost bin truckload sale coming up May the 16th that we're going to hold this year, this spring, instead of here where I normally have it. We're going to have it at the new Houston Botanic Garden. So that might be kind of fun. These are basically $70 rain barrels, and we've been doing this for a few years. What I like about it is kind of a starter thing, so that you can get the public kind of involved in the idea of harvesting rainwater. And is this going to stop using for flooding? No. But it kind of gets people's kind of head in the game, and what can I do in my garden? And then outside, we have a bioswale, a little demonstration bioswale right down, in the right of way as you walk towards the dead end of Washington. So that was done by Engineers Without Borders, a nonprofit, in collaboration with the city of Houston. We did some of the work with redoing a driveway and redoing the curb and all that kind of stuff. But basically, Engineers Without Borders got out there, got some sponsors, and we actually have an honest goodness bioswale with pervious pavers, right next to it in the sidewalk, helping water get to that. And we have two types of the planting. We have kind of a planted side, and we have a turf side. Okay, so and we've got that very graphic out there that's in a weatherproof sign so that people can kind of learn about it. So that doesn't exactly like turn Houston green, but the point is we're trying to have some sort of initiatives that show people touch and feel sort of idea on how this kind of thing works. So Anna, take it away.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out again. I am here. I'm the Clean Water Associate with Environment Texas. So we're a statewide nonprofit that does work to protect clean air, clean water, and open spaces across the state. I work on clean water, so I get to kind of go all over the state and talk about clean water. And it's been really exciting to see the different initiatives going on. And I'll kind of touch on your question a little bit about water quality and how different cities talk about green infrastructure, nature-based infrastructure, because it's called different things in different places, and give you a little bit of context. And so I'm going to do that through this report that I recently published. It's we call it the Texas 2020 Stormwater Scorecard. We analyze the policies promoting nature-based infrastructure, including green infrastructure and low-impact development, in the stormwater management policies of various cities and local governments throughout the state. So here are the local governments that we surveyed. There's 10 of them, 9 cities and 1 county. We got both Harris County and Houston in there, so there's a lot of kind of local information about what these policies are like. And tonight I'm gonna talk a little bit about kind of what our scorecard was, how we determined what types of policies help to support nature-based infrastructure, and then talk about some of the exciting policies that are unique to various cities across the state, and then go through the rankings, the scores that each city got, and then some of the recommendations that actually include passing this set of proposed incentives for Houston. So to start off, here are the categories that we looked at in analyzing the policies of various cities. And there are kind of 3 main categories or sections that they were divided up into. So we looked at private development regulations, ways that includes water quality and stormwater detention. So that's kind of the quality and quantity sides of the equation that we were talking about before, and maintenance requirements. So once you install these features, do you actually have to take care of them, maintain them, and make sure they continue to work properly? Then there's incentives, which are kind of the proposed incentives we were talking about before, fit into these categories of incentives that encourage private developers to use these features and to get to know how to use them. Because we have seen that once developers start using them, they keep doing it. They're fun, people like them, it often increases property values. I had one developer in San Antonio tell me, I have never seen units sell as quickly as the ones that we put a rain garden in front of. So there's a lot of excitement once people start to learn what these techniques are. Then the last big section was public initiatives. So does the city include these features on public sites? Do they have an education program? Do they monitor and maintain public programs? And do they collaborate with other entities in the region to help preserve water quality and protect the environment? So there's, over the course of all of these categories, there's a big diversity in how different cities and counties across the state tackle each of these issues. So we tried to make the categories as broad as we could while still capturing some real information about how good the policies are. Each category is ranked from 0 to 4, basically 0 being nothing, 1 kind of being the lowest amount of action in that category that could create a real difference, and 4 being on par with global leaders like Seattle, Singapore, Philadelphia, the cities that are really, really big programs in nature-based infrastructure. So I'm going to start off and talk about a couple of the really cool initiatives across the state. These are cities that had awesome public initiatives. See, Houston's on there for kind of considering green infrastructure on all public projects. But the most exciting one to me on this list is actually San Antonio. Their modeling of water quality is really, really impressive. They've gone block by block and said, okay, where does the stormwater go? Where is it picking up pollutants? How is it going to flow into our waterways? And they're using that modeling to determine, where do we need green infrastructure? Where should we build this into the city to have the most effect on water quality? And they're going to target those places first for adding green infrastructure to the city. So it's a really, really exciting initiative. There's also, I'd like to highlight Austin and Dallas for the planning that they've done. I think Houston's proposed incentives and the new resilience plan could definitely also be up here with these plans from Austin and Dallas. But Austin is really impressive for they have a bunch of plans like Water Forward, Functional Green, the Climate Action Plan. They touch on various aspects of city development, and they've incorporated green infrastructure into each one of those plans to help get it into as many places as possible. Dallas was also really instrumental in designing iSwim, which is a set of kind of development recommendations that is available to governments kind of in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, and Dallas helped create it. And they also integrated it into their own drainage manual so that developers and engineers can look at one place and get all the information they need, which is really useful to not have a whole bunch of different places you have to go to get information. Then there are a couple of cities that kind of have a really strong focus on water quality, and that helps. It's generally one of the best ways that cities can go about going after nature-based infrastructure possibly without the combined sewer system and consent decree that we were talking about earlier. And so Denton does a really good job of looking at local water quality in especially environmentally sensitive areas within the city. And they have particular regulations on if you're developing a greenfield site that's never been touched before by development, they're really careful about trying to protect water quality on those sites. And Farmers Branch has brand new water quality and stormwater detention requirements, which in some ways are the essential first step to actually adding nature-based infrastructure into a city. And then the last three that I want to touch on are really cool because they have super specific programs that are really interesting, and I think some of them are really fun. Harris County, for example, has a drone-based monitoring program. So they have some kind of bigger county-sized nature-based infrastructure features, and they can use drones to monitor those systems, see how well they're working, and to update and improve future systems that they produce. San Marcos has a really cool maintenance program that helps to educate owners of these systems when they need to know how to maintain their facilities. How it works is if any feature fails its annual inspection, the city will actually go to the owner, talk to them, educate them, tell them how to better maintain it, create a plan with them for improving its maintenance, and then reevaluate the site. So that helps to kind of get information out there about, so a lot of these techniques are new. People don't necessarily know how to use them, and so getting that education is really, really useful. And then El Paso, I really, really like this project. It's a pilot project that's going to be starting in March, so coming up really soon. They're going to look across the city on streets and see where stormwater pools. Anywhere it pools, they're going to cut a curb cut, try and direct that stormwater into the median of the road or a planter next to the sidewalk and plant a street tree. So they're trying to increase the street trees in the city at the same time as kind of dealing with the stormwater runoff, specifically by looking for the places where already naturally the stormwater pools. So just a couple of really cool little projects. And now with all of those recommendations, I want to go into the rankings for each city. I'm going to preface this by saying no city in Texas got an extremely high score. There's still a long way to go with improving the way that we advocate for nature-based infrastructure. But you will see that there is kind of a range, and we'll talk about the recommendations that we gave from Environment Texas to these cities to help improve the scores. So here it is. This is the rankings. You can all see them. San Antonio and Austin are tied for first place, which is really exciting, especially for San Antonio. Austin was in first place last time we released this scorecard, but San Antonio's done a lot of really good work recently, including that water quality modeling. They also now require green infrastructure along the San Antonio River. If your property is next to the river, you have to use GSI for your water quality requirements, which is really cool. So that's exciting for them. And then you can see kind of all the way, there's a big variety of the different rankings. Houston is not super high on the list, and mostly that's because the city doesn't have any incentives for private developers right now to help encourage that use, which could change as these new proposed incentives become adopted in the city. So now I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about some of the recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of them. There are a couple that I think are really interesting that I'd like to kind of bring up for everyone.
What pushes Harris County up so high on that list?
Harris County has a lot of really cool programs, especially kind of education and maintenance and monitoring and keeping track of where they all are, that I think they don't. Harris County is interesting because they have fewer, since it's a county, they have fewer ways that they're allowed to kind of incentivize and require various kinds of nature-based features, but they do a really good job with the education and supporting people who want to use these programs and with kind of monitoring water quality.
And I can address that in more detail later when we get through that.
Cool.
And you can check out the scorecard itself. There's a lot more detail in it. So two of the most exciting, I think, recommendations are both Austin and Dallas have proposed requiring GSI or nature-based infrastructure citywide. Austin's could become law when the new land development code, cross your fingers that it does pass, when it passes at the end of March. It would require green stormwater infrastructure on all urban sites, which would be really, really exciting for getting this into the city. Dallas has also talked about requiring it, and it was going to be in the October drainage manual, but then it was pulled, and they're working to try and put it back in the drainage manual. Whichever one of these cities actually gets to it first will become by far the leader in the state when it comes to encouraging nature-based infrastructure in the city. Then also this goes back to the water quality question again. All of these cities could do a lot to promote nature-based infrastructure by expanding water quality requirements across the city. And I think Houston also could be on this list. The only reason it isn't is that there are these proposed incentives that haven't been implemented yet. And that was our major recommendation for Houston, was pass these incentives. It could give the city a full 5 points, which, going back to the rankings for a second, would put Houston up with Harris County around 3rd place. So really exciting opportunity in passing these incentives to really improve where Houston is in compared to the rest of the state. And so just kind of summary of the report, what it says. I think there's a lot of room for improvement across the state in how we support nature-based infrastructure, but there's also a lot of really, really cool ideas. So I think we just need to keep pushing for it, keep making sure that our elected officials, that people who are representing us and making these laws really know that we care about nature-based infrastructure, we care about all the benefits that it can bring, and we want to see more of it in the city. So in Houston, let's get to passing these incentives and making sure that we have more of it in the city. So again, this is the title of the scorecard, and that's my email if you have questions, and I guess we can go into asking questions to all of us now.
Okay, so we have any further questions? We have plenty of time for questions tonight. Anybody want to ask about any of this?
Well, first, Anna, welcome to Houston, where cheap, fast, and stupid is kind of the theme for construction. Starting with cheap, where around here could the biggest impact be made for the least upfront investment, since that seems to be what everyone thinks about? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think that the easiest way, especially in urban environments, to incorporate green infrastructure and the benefits that it has is to just put it in every single landscaping feature that you create. It's not that hard. So one thing that we actually also just got added to the land development code in Austin is every single graded piece of landscaping is required to be sunken. So just a little bit depressed. It doesn't need a lot of engineering. It doesn't need a lot of special calculations to make it work. It's just make it lower than any impervious surface around it so that stormwater can flow into it and has a chance to soak into the ground before running off. So those are things that are really, really cheap, even beyond I should say that most green infrastructure features are cheaper than the conventional equivalent, as long as you kind of know what you're doing and you don't have a really steep learning curve in creating it. But aside from that, I think just doing these really simple landscaping adjustments into how we think about creating landscaping could have a really big impact.
I think with regard to costs, the philosophy of modern gray infrastructure is to, get the water away from the developed area as fast as possible and minimize maintenance activities by having the system be self-flushing and not amenitize it, right? And so if you think about the normal storm sewer system, going to a bayou, going out to the bay, there's really no maintenance, right? You put it in the ground and maybe 50 years in, you gotta do some fix-ups or replacements or repairs, but there's not ongoing maintenance. And the initial cost is fairly high, but then the running cost is zero, right? In green infrastructure, we're changing the whole paradigm. We're now saying that we want to amenitize that and we want to capture every piece of litter and every piece of sediment in that system right there in front of the sidewalk, right there in front of where the kids walk and you walk and the tenants walk and the owner walks. And so the ongoing maintenance is very, very high because you're treating it like a park. If the school field across the street from you or down the block from you never mowed that field, there'd be riots, right? People would be very upset. So we are taking our drainage system and converting it into parks that are required to have maintenance every day. And for most cities and counties, that is a potentially huge issue. Where do you get the people and the money to do that? Now, the county uses it in roadway medians, and they're using native grasses and they're woody native bushes and shrubs and trees. They don't have to mow as much. So if it's a county-maintained roadway median, they love it because it actually reduces their O&M costs. But most county roads are operated by the mud, not by the county. So the question is, if you're a city of 675 square miles and you operate every single linear feet of roadway in that whole city, where do you get the money and the people to maintain all that? So it's a huge shift in our expectations of what the drainage system does and what it looks like every day.
Yeah, let me do a zoom in on that, okay? This is our little bioswale outside, okay? And so we walk to our parking, which is under I-45, okay? So that's the entry and exit sequence every day for people that park there, okay? Every day I walk down the sidewalk and I'm picking up some litter, okay? Because that's mine. Okay, so I'm not going to have broken windows there, and I'm not going to have a bunch of garbage in my doggone bioswale. All right, so I'm picking this stuff up. Where's it coming from?
paid for that, by the way.
Yeah, I know. But the question is, where does it come from? Are people really just like throwing that stuff, or then there's I-45. How much of that's coming out of the car windows? Okay, that makes me sick. How much of that stuff is coming out of the car windows? Well, anyway, I think a lot. But the point is everything he said about drainage topside it turns into a maintenance issue. So I'm just saying, yep, sure does. And I don't know how we have enough people in our parks department to take care of cleaning up all the litter or do some public works, which I'm in. I don't know about that. So that's why these things don't happen.
So the business case to the public about why to convert to that paradigm is the long-term benefit, right? The long-term value of having an amenitized, beautiful stormwater management system is higher quality of life. It is higher property values. It is a nicer city, a heat island reduction. What else?
No, you covered.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you said something else. So there's all these benefits that we get that would be material benefits that could be monetized, right? You could estimate that 30-year total present value, and compare that to the total present value of the O&M, and it should be a slam dunk. It's definitely better than a concrete pipe underground.
But you are essentially flipping capital cost to operating cost.
Yeah, so the public works guy or gal, in this case, Director Haddock, is like, wait, you want to take how many people and what kind of budget away from me? And the parks guy is like, yay.
I want to add 2 points. One thing that is different for Houston, for Harris County, for this region, like Southeast Texas, when you compare it to San Antonio or to Austin, is the amount of rain that we get and how big our green infrastructure systems would be required to be. So first, designing those systems and then maintaining those systems is a little bit different. Also, our soils don't infiltrate as much water. A lot of it is a big debate on whether our soils are conducive to a green infrastructure or not. I think they are. We just need to think more outside the box and be more creative. But it does require that culture shift as well, whereas some cities across the U.S. and across Texas may have it a little bit easier in that way. The other thing I want to bring up is Houston is a city with the most green space in the United States. And we don't capitalize on that green space in terms of converting it into these dual purposes, right? And so it's really understanding of where this green space is and how we can maximize the benefit that it provides to bring it into what is needed for us, detention, but also incorporating the water quality benefits. So looking at where it is located and how we can bring it back into the urban core and the more densified areas of the city is what's important. So.
Another thing, when we zoom in, I'll do the bioswale story again. Every time it rains, it's full of water, like it's supposed to be. And then after a couple hours, it's wonderful self again without any water in it. So what it's done is it's held on to the water for a couple hours before it goes into, because it drains to a drain. Okay, and it's Type-E inlet right out there on the street. But the point is, it's held up, it's detained for a while. And so everybody in the building who walks by there, when it's raining, I don't know if they're really looking at it and going, hey, it's doing its job, but it is. So
I have a question regarding the first presentation about one of the goals of preserving 24% of the current existing open space. So I was curious what the baseline for that was, like what's included, and what would the strategy be for maintaining that percentage over time, considering that we have increased development over time and that sort of thing. So how do we hold that number?
Sure. So that is actually an action that Parks has been trying to pursue for the Houston Parks Department has been trying to pursue for some time. As we continue to see the city expanding, growing, and developing, looking at areas that the city already owns, properties that it already owns, and preserve that green space. To be able to not include parks in the sense of a community center or a baseball field or a soccer field, but that native prairie or native wetland environment that is there and does exist. So in terms of the goal and in terms of how it's specified in the resilience strategy, that is something that as a city we have to figure out exactly how to implement, because it would require an ordinance to do so, and it would require for it to pass council.
So is that referring then to existing public land or park land, and it's not including private undeveloped land?
It is including public land. It is including land acquired by Houston Wilderness through their regional conservation plan for land. It is land by other agencies and partners like the Houston Parks Board as well. So within the entire city of Houston, for the goal to be 24% by 2040, I believe.
Okay, so we're just on the city of Houston land, okay. But
What
that's
is
not
it?
including private, that's not including any privately owned green space that's not currently developed, that sort of thing. So all of that, no percentage of that, it's not looking at trying to preserve any percentage of that existing undeveloped land.
Right.
Michael, the incentives that you covered, you've talked a lot about infrastructure, but is there much overlap in residential and commercial building construction?
Well, I mean, what do you mean by overlap?
Like, do those incentives apply to buildings, or is it just infrastructure and sites?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intent of the incentives was very much to try to change the behavior of folks that were doing larger scale developments, like a mixed use or an apartment building or some commercial development. It wasn't really intended to be at the single family house or, you know, a small property type of approach. And so, you know, to a large degree, right, our scope was very much focused on commercial development, commercial real estate, rather than single family residential.
Michael, so you mentioned that part of the incentives was to try and make the building like requirements like setbacks and parking minimums like more streamlined to promote. Right. How specifically?
So what we've set forth is a bunch of performance standards or outcomes that we want to try to achieve, and the devil's in the details in terms of the stakeholder process, right? So if you were to look at the implementation part of this thing, the integrated GSI development rules were intended to be, I guess it would be 12 plus 3, so that's 15 months of work to figure that out, to answer that question. But the performance requirements, if you download the PDF, it's got basically a bunch of bullet points where we articulate the main focus points there, and I'll try to highlight a couple of them. Reduce parking requirements if GSI is used. So especially like in the context of the two extreme paradigms would be a hedge around the sidewalk or near the sidewalk, massive amount of surface parking, and then the retail establishment, in the center of the lot, right? With all underground storm sewer systems and a big manhole for stormwater quality. So what if you just completely flip that and put the building up against the pedestrian way and had a big bioswale system in the back with lots of green space and parking and less parking, right? Then you could do that, right? And so that's what we costed out in our analysis in the appendix. So there's two renderings of that in plan view, the car-centered idea and the pedestrian-centered idea. That's just one example.
Was the green infrastructure one cheaper in your model?
Oh, yeah, because it reduces the detention volume, it reduces the conveyance costs, the concrete pipes. I mean, it's much cheaper to convey stormwater in a ditch than in a concrete pipe. With cement stabilized sand backfill and the trucking of the concrete pipes to and from the manufacturer, not to mention the carbon footprint.
There is a number in the report.
What's
like
that?
a number of.
Yeah, I mean,
the
appendix. Yeah, the appendix has our cost estimate with the takeoff. I mean, if you're an engineer, so here's the rendering of the car-centered version, and here's the rendering of the pedestrian version, and all the costs are in here.
Are the same number of cars in both of those?
No, it's reduced parking.
So where do the cars go?
The person who's going to that store is taking Metro or an Uber.
Is what?
Taking a Metro or a bus or Uber. Uber is one of those funky little apps they have nowadays where you can get a ride for a couple of bucks.
I will say there's this piece that says, so the study overall project costs were reduced by about 2% using GSI, and then site costs, so landscaping, paving, stormwater management, were reduced by 34% for using GSI.
So that's worth clarifying. So if you're building a 3 or 4 story mixed-use development with retail and apartments, Class A apartments and retail around the outside, a large percentage of that cost is the building and the finishings and the HVAC. Like, there's not much in the site costs, but the site costs were reduced by 34%. The total cost of the whole project, including the finishings and architect stuff, was only a 2% reduction. So, but when you look at in terms of the revenue side, think about how attractive it would be to the tenants, the people who are paying rent, to actually be in that and to generate revenue for you. So your upfront costs are slightly reduced, but your lease up is faster, and the faster you start making revenue, the quicker off you can pay your money gal over here who lends you all the equity, or who has equity stake in the deal, right? Or lends you money.
Only lend you if you included GSI. So.
Right.
Hi, my name's Sheila, and I was part of the Houston Land and Water Sustainable Forum when we did that big project. And one of the other things we did is we held big seminars with public works staff to try and really get them educated on it. And there was one criteria that we ran into that we still need to solve, and that is the width of the right-of-way. In many areas of the city, you've got all kinds of entities and stakeholders trying to use that same 60-foot width, not just the paving and the driving, but you've got all the utilities and the franchises with the telephone companies and the cable companies, and maybe cable straight away. But so I think it's also an integration thing. So we're talking about it as if it's a silo. But as we get into less single occupancy vehicles, then there'll be more lane space, and then there'll be more space in these right-of-ways. For example, that's just one. So where do you see it going with those kind of limitations, and how do we deal with those?
I'll let other folks chime in, but my quick answer is that retrofit situations are always challenging. I mean, you're doing something and suddenly you find out there's a $1 million fiber optic line, like exactly where you want to be. Oops, what are you going to do, right? I mean, so right-of-way width is a huge issue, retrofitting is a huge issue. So to me, the bigger opportunity and the easier stuff is when you do a total reconstruction, maybe you do right-of-way expansion, you're acquiring more land, or you partner with a developer to do something on private property, right? I mean, the cities that are moving forward with big public right-of-way retrofits, it costs them like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars per square foot of bioswale because of all the utility conflicts and all the issues. I'm just saying, it's very, very, very challenging.
I'd also say, as you talked about, the way our city streets look is going to be changing dramatically in the near future. We're incorporating more public transportation, more bike lanes, more, there's more incentive for street trees, for green infrastructure, for all these different components. And I think there are a lot of really cool programs like Dallas's Complete Streets. They have very detailed kind of plans for different kinds of streets and how those streets look. And so creating those plans with all the different pieces that are a necessary part of a street incorporated into it, I think is going to be really important for planning each project. When we go to a street, if we're going to be doing construction on that street, how do we make sure that we're tackling all the different issues at the same time? I think having those plans to begin with is going to be really important.
Thanks, Michael. So 2 things. The planning department is already looking specifically at complete streets and walkable places and how to integrate sidewalk, bike lane, road, and green infrastructure in it. So that is moving forward in terms of how we're integrating. It is very much a thought process and a culture change within the city that is being driven through the different departments. And this is why the internal coordination is so important and why we have a monthly meeting between Houston Parks Department, between Public Works, between Housing and Community Development Department, between the Resilience Office, to really make sure that we link up to all the different efforts that are moving forward to make sure that they're aligned. The second thing is a large portion of Houston is roadside ditches. So we have an opportunity there to look at our own infrastructure. Not all the entirety of Houston is under underground storm sewer system. And so looking at those areas that have ditches that convey water, many areas, many homeowners that I've seen have already tried to incorporate green infrastructure on their own to make these ditches more beautiful. It is a concern, and I want to add a caveat that, you know, there are encroachments in the right-of-way that do prevent flow, and these ditches are meant to move water out. And so we can get a little more creative with the infrastructure that we have in our city and make these ditches actually be something beneficial for us.
You commented about all these different departments that are involved. Is the traffic department included in all of this?
So that would be in transportation and drainage operations within Public Works.
Where I'm going specifically, now we're talking about huge developments, all that, but I'm talking about an individual homeowner. In order to get a building permit, they say you have to tear out the sidewalk and the driveway that you built just a few years ago. And instead of being 12 feet wide, your sidewalk and your driveway entrance has to be 20 feet wide now. And the sidewalks, instead of being 4 feet wide, have to be 5 feet wide. So I've got to add another 150 square feet of concrete. That may not be a whole lot, but if you multiply this times 100,000 houses or 1 million houses, that's 100,000 square feet of more concrete, which doesn't absorb water very well. So shouldn't they be in on this as well? You know, 2 people use this sidewalk. Why does it have to be 5 feet wide?
So we have to be in compliance with ADA rules, disability, to make sure that there is enough space for people with disabilities to be able to move through the sidewalks. And so that is the primary reason of why it's going into 5 feet. That being said, there's an opportunity for us to look at permeable pavement in these sidewalks and other types of materials that can be used in these sidewalks as well. So, but that is a valid point. The planning department is just hired a chief transportation officer as well to look specifically at some of these issues, not just in terms of mobility for the entire city, but also at how we integrate pedestrian and bike mobility into Houston.
And a quick question, and I'm sure if you go to any other city, that if you go during a heavy rain, if you go to the poorest neighborhoods, that's typically where the worst flooding and pooling is on streets. Are there any metrics in your scorecard to incentivize cities to help mitigate that issue?
So we look at, we don't specifically address kind of, you know, the environmental justice issues associated with a lot of these issues in the scorecard itself. But it is, you know, it's obviously a really big issue, and it's kind of, you know, because these areas have, part is because they have fewer trees, they have fewer green spaces, they are generally, the sewer systems that take care of the stormwater are less well maintained in disadvantaged areas of the city. And I think that we have to make sure that as we're incorporating green infrastructure, we're aware of that and saying we need to put this in the spaces that matter most. Which is why things like San Antonio's way of looking at water quality, where is the biggest issue, and let's put green infrastructure in those places first, why that's so important. We also, at the same time, need to be aware of the fact that green infrastructure does raise property values. So gentrification is a really big issue in cities across Texas at the moment, and adding green infrastructure to these neighborhoods to solve those problems can make gentrification worse. So we need to make sure that as we're incorporating it, we also have good housing policy that helps to allow those communities to stay in their homes as their communities get the benefits of green infrastructure. So it's a really complicated.
It feels like a catch-22, because then on the flip side, it's like, okay, so you're not going to help these people, you know, because it'll increase their property value, you know?
Which is why we need to have the green infrastructure and the housing policy. They need to go together, and they need to go to these areas first, or they're going to be displaced.
Absolutely.
So it's something that it's kind of too big to fit into the stormwater scorecard, but it's definitely something that we need to keep in mind as we expand green infrastructure across the state.
One of y'all had a bullet up there about, I think, the city of Houston, about the possibility of having more flexibility with respect to trees and shrubs. What's behind that comment? What's the problem with
that's
the
related,
list of trees
that's
and so
related
forth?
to the ordinance regarding landscaping. So I probably would be hard pressed to remember the exact details, but basically either an ordinance or the design manual requires, it's very prescriptive about the type of shrubs and or trees that are required both on private property and along the public right of way. And so if you have that kind of very sort of inflexible requirement, and someone comes in with something like they want to do a bioswale or they want to do something innovative, then that can be a conflict. And then it prevents the person from being creative and doing something cool because of this sort of one-size-fits-all, you know, maybe good intentioned adoption of a requirement or a rule back in the day that now maybe we want to be more flexible. That's why we want to spend 15 months in a stakeholder process ironing out all those details. And I would say too that the general discussion around how best to utilize public land, this grid, the 675 square mile grid of publicly owned land that we have, that is also fundamentally a political policy decision. And so, you know, one person's silver bullet bioswale is another person's, you know, end of the world screaming match at City Hall. I've seen it firsthand in my neighborhood about bike lanes and trees.
Has there been aerial hydrological modeling so you actually see where green infrastructure would work better, or you give the same incentives whether you're in an area where you really don't need the green infrastructure versus upstream where it's more prevalent, where it would help more?
Well, so the Harris County Flood Control District is modeling all 22 watersheds for volume as part of the remapping. We just learned that our estimate of the 1% annual chance rain event was low by like 40%. And so now we're remapping all the floodplains, and that is going to be, not only is that going to be detailed modeling of the bayous, but also two-dimensional modeling of every square foot of the county. And that will show us where all the low points are, all the flood-prone areas, and even non-riverine, areas of higher probability of inundation. So that's all, 4 years, give or take 4 years away. And I would say that the volume issue is much more important than the stormwater quality issue, honestly. And I would also say that whether you're designing a storm sewer system out of concrete or green, you still have to handle 18 inches of rain in 24 hours. And green infrastructure will not solve flooding.
We, as in the Recovery and Resilience Office, have partnered with U of H, and we actually have a PhD student working with us right now to develop a model to look at where to best place green infrastructure.
Cool.
Yeah, super cool. Student started earlier this year, and so as we're going through her dissertation, helping identify what best data she needs to be able to execute that model. So more results will be coming out of that. The other thing that Houston Public Works is doing right now, and they've partnered with the Parks Department to look at different types of green infrastructure and where they would work best in different types of parks. So what type of green infrastructure feature would work best in a ball field versus a playground. And so trying to identify the main features and the main components that would link up to develop this site prioritization study for specifically for parks.
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly about green infrastructure and flooding. There's, I think a lot of debate back and forth about to what extent does green infrastructure help you deal with flooding. And I think, it's clear that you aren't going to be able to contain a Harvey-like storm with some rain gardens throughout the city. But I think it's really important. I think that looks at flooding from one particular point of view, which we think about floodwater as this X amount of water that's barreling towards some kind of levee or dam that needs to hold back all that water. And the benefit of green infrastructure is to say, let's make a more resilient system, something with rain gardens throughout the city that can help take the pressure off of our flood systems, so that in a situation like Harvey, the rain was really uneven throughout the city. If the places where the rain had built up had more rain gardens, had more ways for that to filter in and diffuse into other areas of the city instead of rushing into the storm sewer systems, then you have a lot less pressure on those systems. So I think that's where you need to think about green infrastructure helping in flooding, is not kind of as the way to catch all that water, but a way to diffuse and create a more resilient system. And so that's why it's important to kind of have it throughout the city and in a whole bunch of different areas, and not just in specific places designated for flood control.
Are we looking at any areas that we're going to actually crack concrete line bayous and trying to create just natural swales? Or is the infrastructure, the gray infrastructure, so well designed that even though it's sending the water downstream as soon as possible, it's already there and it's not going to be removed?
Just to clarify your question, are we looking at any areas that require maintenance?
That you'd actually get rid of the concrete and put in, and just return it. Kind of like Buffalo Bayou, that was going to be a concrete lined bayou all the way through downtown until Terry Hershey decided to stop it, or help stop it. And now we've got a lot of concrete lined bayous that we walk along, and is it even feasible to do the kind of assessment that it would take?
I mean, that's a question really for Harris County Flood Control District, who's not here, they're not in the room. But my quick answer is that there's been some work to look at some segments of White Oak Bayou in particular, and some others to look at the hydraulics of that idea. And the harsh reality is limited right-of-way, limited gravity, and so the surface of that conveyance really matters in terms of what you can do to get the water out and prevent flooding both upstream and downstream, or limit the risk of inundation upstream and downstream. So by making it rougher, someone has to pay a cost there with a higher risk of flooding potentially, because we have limited right-of-way and limited depth, and friction matters.
I do want to add, and I cannot speak for Harris County Flood Control, but they are conducting an extensive buyout program through the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and a lot of that is focused in areas in the floodway and adjacent to bayous to help with the issue of right-of-way, to be able to expand the capacity of the bayous in certain areas.
Yeah.
So I'd encourage you to reach out to them.
Well, okay. Dawson's other questions? All right. How about a round of applause? What is that? Thank you very much, panel. That was a really interesting presentation, and I think some of the best answers I've heard in a while. It's kind of nice. Anyway, so stay tuned for future education seminars, and thanks for coming.